Bruce Lee Slocum, and it's Bruceleeslocum.
And Bruce, you spent a lot of time. Oh, I'm getting a little wind noise. I think, yeah, the mic needs to go down a little lower in your shirt. Do you want to get that? Great.
We're getting a little wind noise, so I'm going to try and pull it down a little lower.
Yeah. Wind usually comes up a little in the afternoons out here.
Yeah. Yeah, it does whip through, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Let's see if I can get that to work. Any better?
Still,
Do you want that little fuzzy cap?
Turn a little bit away from the wind, maybe that'll help.
It's just when we're having a big gust and getting a hole.
You still have this little wind?
We have
I
a
do.
wind.
Good luck getting it threaded on there.
We have a little wind guard that
They're
we can
in
put
the
on that
case,
mic too.
and
Oh.
if you pull
keep
out
the
the
wind
little
out.
plastic attachment
He's
thing,
digging it out right now.
see the little plastic? There. The little fuzzy.
Must be a tiny thing because the pop filters are used for music were pretty good size, and so were the
Yeah.
mics.
Well, this little, you see how small that little mic
Oh,
is?
yeah.
It's a teeny little thing. But you know, it's great because it pretty much just limits the sound right around here.
Yeah.
So it's really nice in that way.
Well, the newer equipment is so much better than
Oh,
what
yeah,
it was
we
when I was
we
using it
just
all
bought
the
a
time.
couple of- That camera there, Jennifer just bought a $2,000 camera.
Yeah.
Ted has an older version. I bought one too, so we have a lot better cameras. But the main thing is we can plug in a mic. And there's cheaper cameras you can't really plug in a mic.
Yeah. Well, Barbara just had one out here when we were working on the Salt River project.
Uh-huh.
That was she rented it because it was like $15,000 for the camera or something.
Is that a red? Did she call it a red?
I don't remember what the name of it was, but I just remember it was an ungodly amount of money for the camera that she was
wow,
using.
she must have good funding for that project.
Okay, I think we're ready to get going.
Okay.
So we'll have you say your name and spell your name.
Again. Okay. Bruce Lee Slocum. It's Bruceleeslocum.
Great. And you are, everybody keeps telling us, Bruce, he's the river guy. He lives on the river. Everything is about Bruce and the river. So you've spent a lot of time on the river.
Yeah, I've been boating around down in the estuary since around 1954-5 when I dug up one of the old redwood seine skiffs that they used to use for commercially fishing salmon out of the mud on the Fern Bridge. And that was my boat for many years, and I graduated other boats.
Now, in the 1964 flood, you were already part of the sheriff's posse. How do you get to be part of the sheriff's posse?
I was actually at that time, it was the Marine Posse was a separate entity from the overall group that we have now, which includes the dive team and the ground pounders and the horse people. It's all kind of in one single unit. But at that time, it was just the Marine Posse, and I was interested in the boats. My first contact with them was when I was working at the signal station in Ferndale, and the owner and his two kids went out in the river perch fishing one night and didn't come back. And early in the morning, his wife called me up and told me, and so I, at that time, had a dock right here. The slough was like 5 times bigger than it is now, and I and several other people had docks out here, floating docks, and I had a boat I kept there. So I went on down and found that they had broken down and spent the night on a sandbar out there and was towing them back. And here comes a couple of guys from the Marine Posse with another boat, and they finished towing them back the rest of the way. And I talked to them, and at that time you had to be sponsored to get in the group. So Al Gray, who was part of the Marine Posse at that time, sponsored me to become a member. And so I did become a member, and I can always date my entrance into the Volunteer Search and Rescue Group because at the first meeting when I was officially a member of the Marine Posse, I was not able to get there because of the '64 flood.
It's trial by fire.
Yeah.
So you, during the '64 flood, there were a lot of people down in this area of Camp Wyatt
Oh, yeah.
who were in trouble because this is 6 feet above sea level.
Yeah, it's fairly low here, and a lot of people were trapped because the water came up so quickly and so much higher than they thought it was going to.
And then you had to go out and help save them.
Yeah, at that time the boat I had was a 16-foot plywood skiff that had floated in off the ocean on a friend's ranch out by Centerville, and he sold it to me for little or nothing. And I had a 25-horse motor on it and a 15-horse motor for a backup, and we went out to various locations, getting people out of their dwellings and back to dry ground. And the last thing we had was late in the afternoon. Tried going out along the Ferndale Highway, which had recently been completed and had very strong barbed wire fences on both sides. And we were going out to a particular ranch to get the people out of there, and got a little too close to the barbed wire fence and got the propellers wrapped up in the fence, which turned the boat over and sunk it right there in the current. And the guy that was with me, one of the firemen, was wearing a wetsuit. I was wearing waders, etc. And the water was about 4 feet deep there, just barely covering the fence. And so it was right along the Ferndale Highway. Everybody was standing up there on the highway watching us go out there and watching us sink. He was a big guy, and he was able to stand in the water there, and I got out by going hand over hand up the barbed wire fence, and I still got scars on my hand to prove it, and got back to dry land. So that was the end of my boat thing. There was another boat going with us. We were going in pairs, and he had twin motors on his with shear pins, and he hit the fence out there and sheared both pins and wound up spending the night down in Arlinda Corners on a floating table in one of the houses at Arlinda Corners.
Oh my God.
So that was my 64-foot adventure.
Now, I think what a lot of people don't realize is when this place was pretty much wall-to-wall water, you didn't know where those fences and that barbed wire were.
Well, right. I've had a problem with that. Even with the jet unit that I use now, if a fence is I got hung up over in Salt River several years ago during a flood. And the problem being that if you're going downstream and the current's fairly strong, which it was, if you hook that fence and don't break it, then you can't back up against the current because it's flowing so fast. Reverse is so much slower than going forward. I learned several years ago to always carry a small pair of bolt cutters with me to clip fences, and in that case that's what I did. Another time I was going up here to take some stuff to a house during a flood and could see the fence coming up, and I just floorboarded the thing and broke the fence and went on through it. But fences are definitely a problem, even with the jet drive, and with the prop it's even worse.
So you got out to some of these places. Where were people waiting for you at their homes to be rescued?
The first one we went to was Ray Olson's place, Charlie Zena's ranch down on Salt River, past the end of Port Canyon Road. And we put in from a road up towards the hills and went out across the fields. And he had a boat there, but didn't want to bring the family out with only one boat. So we went down and we got them out. And then he and I went back with the two boats and got some people out of another house that was a little bit farther up Port Canyon Road, and which was eventually destroyed by the flood and the aftermath.
Now, did you live down here at Camp Weodd at the time?
At that time, I was living in Ferndale at my folks' place, up near the fairgrounds.
And the fairgrounds were pretty busy then because that was a big rush.
Oh yeah, that was the place where everybody that was being flooded was going, and those that could get their livestock up there was taking the stock up there.
This place down here where you have is a beautiful spot, but this really would have been under a lot of water.
Oh yeah, there was about, well, you saw how high the floor is in the house over there, and there was 3 feet of water over the floor in that house. Right down here where that concrete building is, there was a milk barn there, about as big as the barns you see around the valley here, a big barn, except that it was 6 feet off the ground on pilings. That whole thing with all the cows went down the river in the flood. The major reason this house stayed here is because that chimney is built on a huge, huge concrete pad underneath there, and that held the house in place. In '95, we had an anomalous flood down here because the mouth of the river was quite narrow and way to the north at that time. And down here, the water backed up because of that situation, and we had within 14 inches of the 64 flood level in the house, but without all the current but it still left a lot of mud.
Wow. How do you clean that mud out?
Well, luckily this place is on what's known as the Riverside Water Company, which feeds Port Kenyon, and there's a few lines that come down to a couple of ranches out here, and so we had water at all times, and we just got in the house with a hose and started hosing everything out. My wife had an herbal mail order business at that time, and stuff on the lower shelves was flooded and ruined, but most of the other stuff was saved. Just about every really good-sized flood, 24 better, comes up to just under the floor level, has come up to just under the floor level.
Mike, can you get his mic just a little bit further down in the shirt?
Wow, it's down in there pretty deep already. Is that better?
So one of the things I was wondering, the people who were kind of organizing emergency services couldn't get over the bridge to Ferndale. It sounded like Ferndale was pretty much on its
Oh,
own.
pretty much. C. Joe Hindley was in charge of civil defense, the guy that ran the fairgrounds. And as far as what I was doing, it had nothing to do with the Marine Posse, which I belonged to. It was being dispatched by the fire department to various locations. The second day I was out with another boat that hadn't got sunk at Waddington, out in that area, ferrying people back and forth across flooded river channels.
Right, yeah, wow. Let's see. So one of the kind of themes that we're noticing in this movie, when we're making it, we're talking to people, is about really how people who seem to have work that they do where they kind of have to rely on themselves, like farmers and dairymen and that sort of thing, seem like they were pretty able to kind of get in there afterwards and kind of fix things and get things back.
Oh yeah, it's been pretty much, you took care of the problems. Down here, we just kind of we're borrowing everything from the river, and the river gets it all in the end. Well, for instance, my freezer over at the ranch over there is up on a platform above the level of 64 flood. So hopefully we'll never have a flood that big again, but like I say, down here in 95 it was within 14 inches of 64.
Yeah, I think that's another thing that kind of has come up when talking to some people is about, how flooding is really a natural part of this environment.
Oh, sure it is. It's, you look at the whole Delta Plain out here. Something I've always found interesting was that 10,000 years ago there was a mini ice age, and sea level was about 300 feet lower along the coastline here. Several years ago they drilled a gas well, or looking for one, up about 3 miles from here. And at 300 feet under the surface of the ground, they hit pieces of redwood. So that tells me that at that time, the Delta Plain, in conjunction with the sea level out here, was about 300 feet lower than it is. Neal River is a very silt-laden stream. You look up there by where I keep my boat, and there are old Sitka spruce stumps that are left over from the last big subduction earthquake in January of 1700. And over the top of them is several feet of sediment, soil, that's been left by the river. The river is supposed to be, one of the stats I use on the nature trips are that the river is supposed to be the most sediment-laden stream in the United States when it's high in the winter, and carries a sediment load 15 times that of the Mississippi. So the sediment builds up rapidly. This house, for instance, you can see it's about 2.5, 3 feet off the ground to the floor level. Woman up at the end of Goble Lane on that ranch there lived here as a child when it was first built back around 1910. They had a laundry room downstairs, so it's probably built up 3 feet of sediment in this area in that relatively short time.
15 times higher than the Mighty Muddy.
Yeah. Yeah, there's approximately a 3,500 mile square watershed, but the Coast Range here is very young geologically, and so that's, like I was talking to a guy yesterday, that's one of the biggest problems that they have with the railroad going up the Eel River Canyon, is that everything's always sliding and falling down, and all of that sediment is falling into the streams that feed into the river, which wind up down here.
People have also been talking about how all that stuff has been collecting in the river and making the river
Maybe. There's been a lot of, since the white people have been here from 1850 on, there's been a lot of changes in the watershed, especially clearing and road building and logging and things like that. Several years ago, one of the things that I heard was that the sediments, because of those activities, had gotten finer, and so there was more fine sediment, which of course was a problem for the anadromous fish, which spawn in the gravel of the riverbeds. As far as the river itself being higher, I see one group of people saying what you did, that the riverbed is filling in with gravel and we got to get it out of there and make the riverbed lower, and you got this other group of people saying, no, don't touch that gravel, the fish need that gravel and we need to leave it right where it is, so don't take any gravel out of the river. So it kind of depends on your point of view, I think, as to what's really going on. When we had that anomalous flood in '95 here, the first thing that the government agencies were looking at was that the 92 earthquakes, the big quake series we had here, had actually raised lowered the floor of the valley here as it raised some of the land out at Cape Mendocino. That ultimately proved not to be, and we finally figured out it was because the mouth was damming the floodwaters back in that year. Because 2 years later, the mouth had dropped to the south again and opened up way up during some storm tides. It was about half a mile across. There, in '97, there was a flood which was the exact same height as the one in '95 on the gauge at Fernbridge, but it was 2 feet lower down here. So, right there it proved that it was the fault of the mouth of the river rather than any raising or lowering of the land mass itself.
Let's see, any questions you guys have?
So, Bruce, you can keep looking at Jennifer when you answer. I was wondering, with the experience you have with the river and how many years you've lived near rivers, what is the thing that people don't understand? What is the one main thing people just don't understand about rivers and their processes through our lives?
Well, I think a lot of people, like in a lot of other natural environments, look on the river when they first see it and think, okay, that's the way it is and it's got to stay exactly that way. It's like the people that look at the redwood forest and say, oh, those forests have been here forever and I see them now and that's the way they have to stay. But they don't realize those trees die, and they don't realize how dynamic the river system is, that it's always changing. The pools are shifting downstream every year a little bit, and so become a different pool. The S-curves that the river forms out in the more flat land out here keep snaking down. That's where you get the oxbow lakes that are left behind by a large S-curve, and then it cuts across the neck of that and becomes a different river channel. You can just, right up where I keep the boat, you can see when I was a kid, just in the 50s, there was a huge amount of pasture land out in what is now river channel. It's all just washed away. And looking back at historical stuff, back to the 1850s, it was in the newspaper and other places, you can see they were trying all kinds of schemes. There was as many as 11 fish canneries down here at one time, all built on the banks of the rivers, and they've all washed away because the river just ate the land away where they were located.
To follow up, we had some other folks tell us about these whirlpools that happened in those areas where the flood happened, and it ended up digging up these huge areas.
Yeah, I remember some of those over on the ranch where I was living over here, and yeah, there was like big places where the land was gouged out as well as sediment was left, and so all that's a function of the speed of the current and the obstacles that the current has to go around.